What if the monster wearing your face was still learning how to smile? The administrative clerk didn't notice at first. How could he? The woman walking through the hab-block corridors looked exactly like his neighbor, Marta Kellen. Same tired eyes. Same gray uniform. Same way of holding her data slate against her chest as she shuffled toward the communal lift. He nodded. She nodded back. The gesture was perfect. Almost. Her smile lasted 3 seconds too long. By the time he realized something was wrong, she had already disappeared into the elevator. By the time he reported it to the Arbites, 17 more people in Hive Tertius had stopped being themselves. And by the time the Inquisition arrived, the things wearing human skin had learned to smile correctly. They call them the Slaugth, but that name doesn't capture what they truly are. It doesn't convey the horror of a species that views your body not as a temple, not as a fortress, but as a suit. A temporary costume made of meat and memory, to be worn until it falls apart or until something better comes along. In the vast nightmare gallery of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where every shadow hides a new way to die, the Slaugth represent something uniquely terrifying. They are the infiltrators who perfect their craft, the parasites who inherit your thoughts, the worms that learn to walk upright. And they've been among us for longer than anyone wants to admit. The first recorded encounter happened on a world whose name has been struck from Imperial records. The administratum does that sometimes when the truth is too dangerous to preserve. What we know comes from fragments, survivor testimonies, classified inquisitorial reports that should never have been declassified. The pattern is always the same. A distant colony stops responding to astropathic communication. Nothing unusual in the Imperium, a galaxy where entire planets can be lost to bureaucratic error. But when the investigation teams arrive, they find cities still functioning, people still working, everything normal. Except everyone is wrong. They speak with slight delays, as if translating from another language. They gather in groups but stand too far apart, like actors who haven't rehearsed their blocking. They eat, but they watch each other eating, studying the mechanics of chewing, the rhythm of swallowing. One investigator described it as watching a play where all the actors had learned their lines phonetically, without understanding the meaning. The uncanny valley made flesh and given administrative duties. And then, when confronted, they split open. Not with violence, not with the rage of a cornered predator. The human body simply opened, like coats being shrugged off, and what poured out defied biological classification. Maggot-white segmented bodies, each as thick as a human arm and as long as a man is tall. Multiple worm-like creatures that had been compressed, coiled, interwoven within the stolen human frame like rope, packed into a bag. They moved with coordinated intelligence, flowing across walls and ceilings, working together as one distributed consciousness, piloting a meat puppet from the inside. The Slaugth are not invaders in the traditional sense. They don't arrive in warships or drop from the skies in invasion pods. They seep, they infiltrate. They already have your face before you know they're there. Their species evolved, if the Ordo Xenos xenobiologists are correct, in the lightless depths of some forgotten world, where survival meant perfect mimicry and absolute patience, where the ability to become something else was the difference between eating and starving. Over millions of years, that survival mechanism evolved into something far more sophisticated. The Slaught developed biotechnology that borders on the supernatural. They craft living ships from bone and sinew. They breed servant organisms like tools. And most horrifying of all, they learn to read the neural patterns of their hosts, absorbing not just the body, but fragments of memory, personality, and knowledge. Imagine dying and remaining aware as something else rifles through your thoughts like files in a cabinet. That's what the Slaught do. They don't just kill you, they learn you, study you, become a terrible approximation of you, good enough to fool your friends, your family, your commanding officers. At least for a while. The Imperium of Man encountered the Slaught during the Great Crusade. That 200-year campaign when the Emperor himself led humanity to reclaim the galaxy. In the fleets of the Luna Wolves, later to become the Sons of Horus, reports surfaced of pale worm-like Xenos discovered on compliant worlds. At first, they seemed like minor threats, local parasites, nuisances to be purged and forgotten. But the pattern emerged slowly, the way a picture forms when you step back from scattered pixels. Worlds that had integrated peacefully into the Imperium began showing signs of corruption. Not chaos corruption, the usual suspect, but something stranger. Entire planetary governments making inexplicably bad decisions. Trade routes shifting for no economic reason. Military deployments that made no strategic sense. The Slaught's weren't conquering, they were editing. Replacing key individuals one at a time. Creating a shadow Imperium where humans still held the positions of power, but the decisions being made served an alien agenda. A slow, patient coup that could take decades to complete, maybe longer. The Slaught think in timeframes that make human lifespans seem like heartbeats. They can wait. They have waited. They are waiting now. One of the most chilling cases involved an entire Adeptus Mechanicus research station. For 15 years, the tech priests of Forge World Metallica maintained regular contact with Outpost Sigma-77, a deep space facility studying ancient Xenotech. Reports came in on schedule. Breakthroughs were announced. Requests for materials were fulfilled. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. When a surprise inspection finally arrived, triggered by a junior adept's paranoid hunch about statistical anomalies in the reports, they found the station still operating. Still staffed. The tech priests still at their workstations, still conducting their research. But every single one had been replaced. Some of them had been Slaught for over a decade. The real tech priests' bodies were discovered in the lower levels, partially dissolved, fed upon over years in some grotesque pantry. The Slaught had been using the station as a base, studying Imperial technology, learning the Mechanicus' secrets, sending perfectly formatted reports designed to deflect suspicion. They had become so good at being tech priests that they had actually made genuine scientific breakthroughs, published papers, earned commendations. The Imperium had been praising its own infiltrators. The station was sterilized from orbit. The papers were redacted. The commendations were posthumously revoked. But the question remained, hanging like smoke in an airless room. How many other stations are still out there? Still reporting, still staffed by things that used to be human? The Inquisition maintains a classified list called the Vermis Protocol. It contains the names of every world where Slaught infiltration has been confirmed or suspected. The list is 3,000 entries long, and growing. Most of those worlds continue to function normally, at least on the surface, because purging an entire planet based on suspicion creates its own problems. Instead, the Inquisition watches, waits for proof, prays they catch the infiltration before it reaches critical mass. Before the Slaught replace enough people that the world stops being imperial in anything but name. But here's what keeps the Inquisitors awake during their meditation cycles. Here's the thought that haunts them when they look at their colleagues, their staff, their trusted advisors. The Slaught have been in the galaxy for thousands of years, possibly longer. They've had time, opportunity, motive, and they are very, very patient. So when that administratum clerk finally worked up the courage to report Marta Kellen's strange smile to the Arbites, when the investigation team broke down her door, expecting to find a parasitic alien horror, they found Marta, just Marta, confused, frightened, completely human. The medical scans showed nothing. The genetic tests came back clean. She was exactly who she appeared to be. The investigation was closed. The clerk was reprimanded for wasting Imperial resources. But as Marta sat in the interrogation chamber, answering questions with perfect accuracy, demonstrating complete knowledge of her own life and history, she smiled at the investigator. And just for a moment, just for the briefest flicker of time, that smile lasted. 3 seconds too long. The Ordo Xenos maintains a facility that doesn't exist on any Imperial star charts. They call it the Vermiary, though never in official reports. It sits in the frozen wastes of a moon orbiting a dead system, far from trade routes and prying eyes. Inside its adamantium walls, in chambers kept at exactly 3 degrees below freezing, they keep them, captured Slaugth. Specimens collected from purged worlds, extracted from dying hosts, preserved in stasis fields that slow but never quite stop their writhing. Inquisitor Helmuth Krestavia has spent 37 years studying them. She's watched them try to burrow through plasteel. She's documented their attempts to communicate through pattern tapping on containment walls. She's observed them go dormant for months, then suddenly surge with activity for no discernible reason. But what keeps her awake isn't what the Slaught do in captivity. It's what they did before capture. She maintains a gallery, a grim museum of the people they'd been wearing. Hololithic recordings, final moments. The instant when the facade breaks and the truth spills out. She's watched a beloved planetary governor deliver a speech to millions, his words stirring and perfect, before his face splits vertically and pale segments cascade from inside his skull. She's seen a mother tuck her children into bed with mechanical tenderness, kiss their foreheads with lips that don't quite press right, then walk to the basement where her real body has been decomposing for 6 months. Each recording is a masterclass in mimicry. Each one is almost perfect, almost. Krestavia has identified the markers, the tells. The smile that lingers, the blink that comes a half-second late. The way a sloth-worn body will tilt its head when confused, not like a human seeking understanding, but like a puppet whose operator is consulting a manual. But here's the horror that she cannot escape. With each generation, with each iteration, the Slaught are getting better. The recordings from 2 centuries ago show obvious flaws. The creatures moved with visible awkwardness, their human suits poorly fitted. The recent captures are nearly indistinguishable. In another century, maybe less, the tells might vanish entirely. The Slaught will become perfect. And then how will anyone know? On a hive world called Drea, a junior enforcer named Ves Carmain made a discovery that would cost him everything. He was investigating a series of disappearances in the Underhive. Nothing unusual in a city of billions where people vanished into the industrial depths daily. But Ves noticed a pattern. The missing weren't the usual suspects, the desperate and forgotten. They were skilled workers, tech adepts, Medicaid personnel, people with specialized knowledge, people whose absence would eventually be noted, but not immediately. And when he cross-referenced their disappearances with sightings of those same individuals in upper hive sectors, his blood went cold. They were being replaced and promoted. Simultaneously, Ves started following them. The woman who'd been a mid-level water reclamation engineer now worked in the governor's palace, somehow having earned a position in infrastructure planning. The Medicaid who'd treated acid burns in the factory levels now consulted for the Arbites on forensic analysis. The tech adept who'd maintained sewer pumps now had access to the hive's power grid control systems. All of them had been missing for weeks before reappearing in higher positions. All of them had gap periods that didn't quite make sense. And all of them, when Ves observed them from a distance, moved with that peculiar deliberation. That studied quality of someone performing humanity rather than being human. He compiled his evidence. 3 months of surveillance, pattern analysis. Testimonies from families who insisted their loved ones seemed different after their returns. He brought it to his superiors. They dismissed him. Told him he was seeing conspiracy where there was only coincidence and career advancement. When he pressed, when he insisted on a formal investigation, he was removed from duty. Psychological evaluation, they said. Stress leave. He was escorted from the precinct by men he'd worked with for a decade, men who looked at him with concern that felt rehearsed. Ves went into hiding, started investigating from the shadows, and that's when he noticed them watching back. The enforcer who'd been his partner for 5 years, the Medicaid who'd treated his daughter's fever, the administratum clerk who processed his ration chits, All of them standing in his street at different times, never together, just watching his HAB unit with empty patience. He realized with creeping certainty that his report hadn't been dismissed. It had been read very carefully. By exactly the wrong people. The night they came for him, Vess was ready. He'd barricaded his doors, prepared a Voxcaster to broadcast his evidence on all frequencies, but they didn't break down the door. They knocked, politely, and when he peered through the spy hole, he saw his daughter, 8 years old, wearing her school uniform, alone in the corridor at midnight. She looked directly at the spy hole and smiled, that smile that lasted just a fraction too long. Vess's hands shook as he realized they'd taken her, replaced her, used her as the key to his door, because they'd learned him well enough to know he'd die before letting his child stand alone in the dark. He opened the door, not because he believed she was still his daughter, but because even the shadow of her deserved to be held one last time. The official report says Enforcer Vess Carmine suffered a psychotic break and attacked his own child, necessitating lethal force. There's no mention of what the sanitization crews found when they cleaned his HAB unit. No record of the pale segmented things they incinerated. No notation of the small body that came apart into components no 8-year-old should contain. But Vess's evidence survived. He dead-dropped it, scattered it across a dozen data caches throughout the hive. Some of it reached the Inquisition. Some of it reached people who knew how to read between lines of official denial. And some of it reached other enforcers, other investigators, other souls who'd noticed the same patterns and thought themselves alone in their paranoia. A network began to form. Quiet, careful. People watching people, looking for the tells, the markers, the slight wrongness that indicated something ancient wearing something new. They called themselves the Witnesses. Not an official organization, not even a formal conspiracy. Just scattered individuals across dozens of worlds who'd seen too much and survived long enough to share warnings. They developed codes, ways of testing each other without revealing their suspicions. Questions only real humans would answer incorrectly, because the Slaughtht were too perfect, too studied in their responses. They shared lists of the infected, marked worlds on private charts, tried desperately to keep ahead of an infiltration that might already be centuries deep. One witness, a rogue trader named Callista Viorin, made a discovery that shattered even her carefully maintained paranoia. She'd been tracking Slaughtht movements through trade manifests, looking for patterns in cargo shipments that might indicate their spread. What she found was worse than infiltration. She found coordination. Across 17 sectors, on 43 worlds, shipments of specific biomaterials were moving in synchronized patterns, genetic samples, neural tissue cultures, preserved organs, all flowing toward a central collection point in the Ghoul stars, that region of space where Imperial authority grows thin and ancient things still crawl. The Slaughtht weren't just infiltrating anymore. They were harvesting, building something. Some vast project that required human genetic diversity on a scale that suggested they weren't trying to replace humanity. They were trying to become it, permanently, perfectly, a merger of species that would create something new, something that could pass any test, survive any purge, because it would be human in every way that mattered except one. It would serve the Slaughtht collective consciousness instead of individual human will. Callista brought her findings to the Inquisition, to Inquisitor Chrysavia specifically, because the old woman's reputation for believing the unbelievable was well known among those who traveled the darker spaces. Chrysavia listened, studied the data, cross-referenced it with her own decades of research. And then she did something she'd never done in 37 years of service. She closed her files, sealed her research, ordered the Vermieri locked down with no exceptions. When her staff asked why, she gave no explanation, simply stared at them with eyes that had seen too much and said that some investigations ended not with answers, but with the wisdom to stop asking questions. But privately, she told Callista the truth. The data was correct. The pattern was real. The Slaught were building something in the Ghoul stars, but what Callista hadn't realized, what her analysis had missed, was that the project wasn't new. The shipping manifests went back not years but centuries. The collection had been happening since before the Horus Heresy, before the Great Crusade, possibly before the Age of Strife. The Slaught hadn't started this recently. They'd been working on it for so long that the project had become background noise in Imperial logistics, so normalized that no one questioned it anymore. Whatever they were building, it was nearly complete. And if it was nearly complete, that meant the Slaught were nearly done hiding, nearly done infiltrating, nearly done being patient. The smile that lasted too long wasn't a flaw. It was a countdown. A tell that would cease to matter once they no longer needed to pretend. Crestavia had spent decades learning to identify them, document them, understand them. She'd become the Imperium's foremost expert on Slaught infiltration tactics. And in that moment, sharing classified data with a rogue trader in a secured chamber deep beneath a frozen moon, she realized with absolute clarity that her expertise was obsolete. Because the Slaught she'd been studying were the Scouts, the advance guard, the patient infiltrators who'd been buying time for something else to gestate in the dark. And now, after millennia of preparation, that something was ready to be born. The question wasn't how to identify them anymore. The question was whether humanity would recognize itself when they finally emerged. Whether there would be any meaningful difference left between the infiltrator and the infiltrated. Whether the war was already over and humanity just hadn't received the notification. Crestavia returned to her gallery that night. Watched the recordings again, the governor splitting open, the mother in the basement, the enforcer's daughter standing in the corridor at midnight. And this time, she noticed something she'd missed before. In each recording, just before the reveal, the Slaugth-worn human looked directly at the recorder, made eye contact with whatever surveillance system had captured their unmasking, and smiled, not the too long smile of an imperfect mimic, but a knowing smile. The smile of a performer acknowledging an audience. They knew they were being watched. They'd always known. The imperfections weren't flaws. They were messages. Crestavia sat motionless in the cold blue glow of her observation chamber, the weight of understanding pressing down on her like the atmosphere of a dead world. The recordings looped endlessly before her, dozens of them now, each showing that same moment of recognition, that same acknowledgement. She'd been cataloging warnings, not failures. Every imperfect smile, every delayed blink, every slight wrongness had been deliberate. A language she'd mistaken for incompetence. The Slaught hadn't been learning to imitate humanity. They'd been teaching humanity to look for them, conditioning the Imperium's best hunters to search for specific markers, specific tells, specific patterns of behavior that would become irrelevant the moment they stopped broadcasting them. She thought of Ves Carmine opening his door, of every investigator who'd found the evidence, followed the trail, discovered the truth. They'd all seen the smile. They'd all recognized the wrongness. And they'd all died thinking they'd caught the infiltrators making mistakes. But what if the mistakes were the bait? What if the entire network of witnesses, all those scattered individuals watching for tells and marking suspects, what if they were exactly what the Slaught wanted? Not opposition, infrastructure, a detection system that would trigger at the exact moment the Slaught were ready to be detected, creating the illusion of last-minute discovery when the reality was something far worse, orchestrated revelation. The Inquisitor's hands trembled as she opened a new file, one she'd kept sealed for reasons she'd never fully articulated to herself. Interview transcripts from a captured Slaught, one of the few who'd ever been made to communicate. The interrogation had taken place 60 years ago, conducted by her predecessor, Inquisitor Vought. The methods used were classified beyond her clearance level, which told her everything about their severity. But the Slaught had spoken. In broken Gothic, through a Vox synthesizer wired directly into its neural cluster, it had answered questions. She'd read the transcript once, decades ago, dismissed it as unreliable. The creature had been dying, its biology breaking down under conditions meant for human prisoners. Its responses had seemed like the ravings of an alien mind trying to conceptualize human language. Now she read them again with new understanding. Question: why infiltrate? Why not conquer openly? Answer: because conquest ends, integration continues. Question: what is your objective? Answer: to be inherited. Question: by whom? Answer: by those who remain when we are gone. At the time, Vought had interpreted this as a reference to some form of genetic legacy, perhaps the Slaughtht attempting to seed humanity with their own biology. But Kristavia saw it differently now. The Slaughtht weren't trying to replace humanity or merge with it in any biological sense. They were doing something more insidious. They were positioning themselves to be remembered, to become part of human identity, so deeply embedded in imperial structure, in human society, in the very concept of what it meant to be human in the 41st millennium, that removing them would mean removing part of humanity itself. She thought of the Hive Andrea, where sloth-worn humans had risen to positions of authority, of the Mechanica Station where they'd made genuine scientific breakthroughs, of countless worlds where they'd served competently, loyally even, for years before being discovered. They weren't saboteurs. They were participants, contributing members of Imperial society who happened to be ancient alien vorms piloting stolen meat. And if that had been happening for centuries, for millennia, then how much of current Imperial culture was actually theirs? How many policies, technologies, traditions had originated from Slaughtht-influenced sources? How many aspects of daily life across a million worlds existed because a worn human had suggested them, implemented them, normalized them? The Imperium didn't just have a Slaughtht infiltration problem. The Imperium might be partially Slaughtht by now. A hybrid culture that didn't realize it was hybrid because the integration had been so gradual, so patient, so perfectly executed that there was no clear line anymore between human innovation and alien manipulation. And if Kristavia revealed this, if she brought this understanding to the High Lords, to the Fabricator General, to the Ecclesiarchy, what would they do? Purge everything that might be tainted? They have to dismantle the Imperium itself, which meant the Slaughtht had already won. Not through military conquest, but through social engineering on a civilizational scale. They'd made themselves unfightable by making themselves integral. The perfect parasitism wasn't taking over a host. It was becoming so necessary to the host's function that removal meant death for both organisms. A vox chime interrupted her spiral of realization. Callista Viaran, requesting immediate audience. Kristavia almost denied it, almost sealed herself in the observation chamber to finish processing the implications, but something in the rogue trader's tone suggested urgency beyond the normal crisis. She authorized entry. Callista arrived within minutes, her breath misting in the cold, her face carrying an expression Kristavia had never seen on the usually unflappable trader. Fear, pure, existential fear. "I found the collection point," Callista said without preamble. "In the Ghoul Stars. Sent a scout probe." It returned with data before its machine spirit failed. She activated a holo projector, and the chamber filled with ghostly images. A structure floating in empty space, biological in nature, grown rather than built. Massive beyond easy comprehension. The scale only apparent when Callista highlighted what looked like a docking appendage and noted it was the size of a battle barge. The structure pulsed with bioluminescence, complex patterns that suggested thought, coordination, purpose. "It's alive," Callista continued, her voice tight. "But it's not a ship, it's not a weapon, it's a library." The probe's Auspex readings showed millions of distinct biochambers, each containing preserved human genetic material, neural patterns, memory engrams. Every person the Slaughtht have ever worn, they've archived, perfectly preserved. Every experience, every thought, every moment of the lives they inhabited. It's humanity's complete genetic and cultural record for the last 10,000 years. Maybe longer, Kristavia stared at the slowly rotating structure, her mind racing through implications. They're not harvesting us to destroy us. They're preserving us. More than that, Callista zoomed in on a section of the structure where the probe's sensors had detected unusual activity. There's growth, new chambers forming. And according to the spectral analysis, some of those chambers contain genetic combinations that don't exist in nature. Human base stock modified with traits from hundreds of different gene lines. They're not just archiving humanity, they're iterating on it, creating variations, improvements by their standard. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I think they're building a species that can survive what's coming. What's coming? Callista closed the holodisplay. Met Kristavia's eyes. I don't know. But the Slaughtht have been around for millions of years. They've seen species rise and fall. Empires that make the Imperium look like a briefly lit candle. And they're acting like something is ending. Like they need to preserve as much human genetic and cultural diversity as possible before we're gone. The infiltration wasn't conquest. It was documentation. Every sloth-worn human was a field researcher gathering data, living human lives to understand us completely before we extinct ourselves. The cold of the chamber seemed to deepen. Kristavia felt the weight of millennia pressing against her thoughts. The Slaughtht weren't monsters, they were archivists. Librarians of flesh, documenting a dying civilization from the inside, wearing its people like recording equipment, gathering every scrap of human experience before the inevitable fall. And the timing of their revelation, the reason they were becoming more visible now, was because they were nearly finished. The archive was nearly complete. Soon they could stop hiding because soon there wouldn't be an Imperium left to hide from. Does the probe data indicate how far along they are? Kristavia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The structure's growth has stopped. It's reached completion. Whatever they needed to preserve, they have it. Callista's jaw clenched. But there's something else. The probe detected outgoing transmissions before it died. The structure was broadcasting. Not to other Slaughtht, to something else. Something in the deep dark beyond the ghoul's stars. Something that answered back. Silence filled the observation chamber like water flooding a sealed room. Kristavia understood then why her predecessor had sealed the interrogation transcript. Why certain investigations were meant to end with the wisdom to stop asking questions, because some answers didn't provide relief. They only revealed how many more terrifying questions existed behind them. The Slaughtht weren't the infiltrators, they were the witnesses. And whatever they were witnessing, whatever they were preparing for, whatever they'd been documenting humanity for across 10,000 years of patient, meticulous observation, it was close now. Close enough that the Slaughtht had stopped pretending. Close enough that they'd completed their archive. Close enough that they were reaching out to something in the darkness and receiving replies. Who else knows about this? Kristavia asked. Just us. The probe's data was encrypted on a personal cipher. I haven't transmitted it to anyone. Don't. The Inquisitor stood, joints protesting the sudden movement after hours of stillness. If the Slaughtht wanted this hidden, they would have destroyed your probe. They let you find it. They wanted someone to know. Someone to understand. She looked at the blank space where the holo-image had been, imagining that vast biological library floating in the void, holding the sum total of human experience in chambers of living tissue. We have to consider the possibility that they're trying to help us. In their way, that the infiltration was never hostile, just thorough. Help us do what? Survive what they know is coming. They've seen it before. Whatever ends species, whatever extinguishes empires. They recognize the signs in us. Kristavia moved to her personal cogitator, began encrypting files, marking records for restricted access. The Imperium is dying, Callista. Has been dying for 10,000 years, slowly enough that we don't notice. But they notice. They've measured our decline across millennia, and they've been trying to save what they can before the final collapse. Then why not just tell us? Why the infiltration? Why the secrets? Kristavia thought of Vescarmine, of the witnesses, of every human who discovered the truth and fought against it. Because we would never listen. Humanity doesn't accept help from Xenos. We'd rather die pure than survive compromised. The Slaughtht understand this about us. They've worn us long enough to know that salvation offered openly would be rejected. So they've saved us covertly, archived us without permission, given us a chance to continue beyond whatever ending they see approaching, even if we never know they did it. The rogue traitor was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who just watched her entire understanding of reality shift beneath her feet. If you're right, if they're trying to preserve us, then what happens when we're gone? What do they do with the archive? Krestavia had no answer. Or rather, she had an answer she didn't want to speak aloud. Because the interrogation transcript had contained one more exchange. One final question and answer that had seemed like gibberish 60 years ago but now resonated with terrible clarity. Question: what will you do with the flesh memories? Answer: we will wear them again, when it is safe. When the night has passed, we will wear them and walk in the light, and no one will know we are not you. Because we will be you, completely, forever. The Slaughtht weren't just archiving humanity. They were preparing to become humanity's legacy. To carry forward human culture, human knowledge, human experience into whatever future existed beyond the approaching darkness. They would be the humans who survived the ending, wearing archived flesh memories like sacred vestments, preserving human civilization by becoming it so thoroughly that the difference ceased to exist. And the most terrifying part, the realization that made Krestavia's blood run cold in the frozen observation chamber, was that this might be humanity's only chance at continuation. The Slaughtht might be monsters wearing human skin, but they might also be the only option left. The thought sat in Krestavia's mind like a toxin, spreading through every certainty she'd built over 3 decades of service. She'd dedicated her life to protecting humanity from Xenos threats, and now she stood on the edge of concluding that humanity's greatest threat might also be its only salvation. The paradox was suffocating. She looked at Callista, saw the same horrified understanding reflected in the rogue traitor's eyes. Neither of them wanted to be right, but the evidence formed a picture too consistent to dismiss as paranoia or misinterpretation. "We can't tell anyone," Krestavia said finally. "Not the High Lords, not the Ordo Xenos command structure. Certainly not the Ecclesiarchy." She began wiping data from her cogitator with methodical precision, each deletion feeling like a small betrayal. "If this information spreads, the response will be immediate and absolute. Purges, inquisitions, entire sectors burned to ash on suspicion alone. And if you're right about the timing, if whatever the Slaughtht are preparing for is imminent, then we can't afford the chaos of a civilization-wide witch hunt. So we do nothing?" Callista's voice carried an edge of desperation. "We just let them continue? Let them keep wearing us, keep infiltrating, keep preparing their archive while we pretend we don't know? Not nothing. We watch, we document. We try to understand the timeline." Krestavia pulled up a star chart, marked with the 17 sectors Callista had identified. "If the Slaughtht are documenting our decline, studying the patterns of our extinction, then they've seen the signs we're missing. We find those signs. We identify what they think is going to kill us. And maybe, if we're fortunate and the Emperor hasn't completely abandoned us, we find a way to survive that doesn't require becoming something else's legacy project." She didn't believe her own words, could hear the hollowness in them. But they were the words an Inquisitor was supposed to say, the response her training demanded. Even as every instinct screamed that it was already too late for human solutions to human problems. That the Slaughtht had seen this moment coming for millennia, had positioned themselves with infinite patience, and humanity was simply following a script that had been written long before any living human was born. 3 months passed. 3 months of Krestavia and Callista working in absolute secrecy, cross-referencing data, tracking patterns, trying to decode what the Slaughtht had learned about humanity's approaching end. They identified correlations that chilled them both. Worlds where Slaugth infiltration was heaviest corresponded exactly with regions showing increased warp instability. The Great Rift's expansion patterns matched Slaugth movement vectors with disturbing precision. Where reality grew thin and chaos pressed hardest against the material universe, there the Slaugth gathered, documenting humanity's response, preserving the gene lines of survivors, archiving the tactics and adaptations that proved most effective. They were studying humanity's war with chaos, not to aid either side, but to understand which humans survived contact with the Immaterian's horrors, which genetic traits, which cultural practices, which psychological frameworks proved most resistant to corruption. The Slaugth weren't just archiving random human diversity, they were curating resistance, building a library of anti-chaos humanity. Every person they wore in the most warp-touched regions was a test subject, a data point in experiments spanning millennia. And the results were being compiled in that vast biological structure floating in the ghoul stars, ready to be deployed when the current human species failed its final exam. Krustavia stood in her quarters late one night, staring at a pic capture of her family from 40 years ago. Before the Inquisition, before the Vermieri, before she'd learned that every smile might be a message and every person might be a suit. Her sister, her nephews, all dead now from natural causes, or what she'd thought were natural causes. She found herself wondering if any of them had been Slaugth-worn, if the sister she'd mourned had actually been mourned by creatures who'd learned to love her through the process of wearing her skin. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, it brought a strange, guilty comfort. At least they'd been important enough to archive. At least some fragment of them would continue, even if it was carried by alien intelligence in human flesh. She understood, in that moment, why some people collaborated with the enemy. Not from cowardice or corruption, but from the simple, terrible realization that the enemy might be right. That survival sometimes required compromises that made the survivors unrecognizable to their former selves. The Imperium had always taught that death was preferable to any alliance with Xenos, that purity in extinction was better than tainted continuation. But standing in her dark quarters, looking at faces that had turned to ash decades ago, Krustavia wondered if that teaching was itself a kind of extinction. A cultural suicide pact that guaranteed humanity would die pure and alone rather than survive changed and accompanied. Her Vox unit chimed, "Callista, emergency priority." Krustavia accepted the transmission, heard the barely controlled panic in the rogue trader's voice before she even spoke. "They're moving, all of them. Every tracked Slaugth signature across 17 sectors is converging on single points. They're abandoning their positions, leaving their hosts. I've got reports coming in from witnesses across the network. People they'd been monitoring for years, suddenly acting normally, too normally. Like whatever was wearing them just stepped out and walked away." Krustavia felt ice crystallize in her veins. "When?" "Started 6 hours ago. It's accelerating. At current rate, by this time tomorrow, every confirmed Slaugth in Imperial space will have abandoned their human hosts and disappeared." Callista's voice cracked. "Krustavia, they're leaving. Whatever they were waiting for, it's happening now." The Inquisitor was already moving, pulling on her armor, gathering weapons that suddenly felt useless against the scope of what they were facing. "The archive. Are they moving toward it?" "No, that's what's strange. The convergence points are all different. Specific worlds, seemingly random distribution. I can't find the pattern. It's like they're evacuating to hundreds of different locations simultaneously." Not evacuation, Krustavia realized with sudden sick certainty. Deployment. The Slaught weren't fleeing. They were positioning. Moving to predetermined locations for some coordinated action. The archive was complete. The documentation phase was finished. Now came implementation. Whatever they'd learned, whatever they'd prepared for, whatever plan they'd been building across 10,000 years of patient infiltration, it was ready. And humanity hadn't even realized the opening moves had been made. She reached the Vermieri's command center to find it in controlled chaos. Astropathic messages flooding in from across the sectors, not just witness reports. Official inquisitorial traffic, planetary governors reporting mass disappearances, Arbite's forces finding abandoned positions, tech priests discovering their colleagues were suddenly, inexplicably, actually themselves again after years of suspected infiltration. The pattern was universal. The Slaughtth were leaving humanity alone, all at once. After millennia of infiltration, they were simply stepping out of their human suits and vanishing into the darkness. One of Krestovia's acolytes, a young woman named Thessaly who'd served faithfully for 5 years, approached with a data slate. Her hands shook as she offered it. "Inquisitor, we're receiving a transmission. Origin point matches the structure in the Ghoul stars. It's broadcasting on all frequencies. Not encrypted. They want everyone to hear it." Krestovia took the slate. "Read the message that would change everything." It was in Gothic. Perfect, unaccented Gothic. Written with a clarity and eloquence that suggested deep understanding of human language, human thought, human fear. "To the inheritors, we have warned you, we have learned you. We have preserved you. What comes now comes for all flesh. We cannot stop it, neither can you. But we have seen it before, on 1,000 worlds across 1,000,000 years. We know what survives. We have made you ready, though you did not know we were preparing you. The humans who remain when the darkness passes will be stronger for our touch, more resistant to corruption, more capable of rebuilding. This is our gift. This is our purpose. We do not ask forgiveness. We do not expect gratitude. We ask only that you remember. When you wear our memories in the age to come, when you rebuild from the ashes using the knowledge we preserved, when you wonder how your species survived its greatest trial, know that we were there. Know that we saved what we could. Know that some of us chose to stay behind in human flesh, to guide you through the coming night, to be the hidden shepherds of a species too proud to accept help openly. Trust no one completely, but do not assume all difference is betrayal. Some of us are still here, still wearing you, still protecting you, and we will not leave until you are safe or we are destroyed. This is the Slaughtth Covenant, witnessed in flesh, sealed in memory, honored unto extinction." The transmission ended. Silence filled the command center like a held breath. Krestovia read the message 3 times, each pass revealing new implications. They hadn't left. Not all of them. Some were still embedded, still infiltrated, still pretending to be human. But now with humanity's knowledge, now with the Imperium aware that they were there, somewhere wearing someone, the paranoia wouldn't end. It would intensify. Every person would be suspect. Every smile would be analyzed. Every slight wrongness would trigger investigation. The Slaughtth had just weaponized humanity's own distrust, turned the Imperium into a society that would tear itself apart, looking for infiltrators who might or might not still exist. Unless that wasn't the point. Unless the message was exactly what it claimed to be, a warning, a preparation, a final briefing before the real crisis began. Krestovia looked at Thessaly, at the other acolytes monitoring Vox traffic, at the tech priests maintaining the Vermieri's systems. Wondered which of them were still human. Which of them had always been Slaughtth, working in the Inquisition's inner circles, learning from the inside, preparing from within. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief. If the Slaughtth had been this close for this long, and humanity still functioned, still survived, still fought its wars, and maintained its Imperium, then maybe their presence wasn't the threat. Maybe the real threat was whatever they'd seen coming. Whatever had made them reveal themselves now, after millennia of perfect concealment. "Inquisitor?" Thessaly's voice was quiet. "What do we do?" Krestovia looked at the young woman. Saw genuine concern in her eyes, genuine loyalty. Or a perfect simulation of both. Impossible to distinguish without destructive testing. She thought of Vescarmain opening his door. Of every witness who died trying to expose the truth. of the archive floating in the ghoul stars, containing the preserved essence of 10,000 years of human experience, of the darkness the Slaught claimed was coming, the night they'd positioned themselves to help humanity survive. "We prepare," she said finally, "for whatever they saw that made them stop hiding." And in that moment, as if the universe itself was responding to her words, every light in the vermiary went dark. Emergency systems failed. Vox networks died. The temperature began to drop precipitously, frost forming on walls that had never known such cold. Kristavia heard screaming from the lower levels. Not human screaming, something else. Something that had been hidden in the facility's depths, in chambers she'd thought were empty, suddenly active and writhing and broadcasting a single message through every speaker, every Vox unit, every communication device still functioning on backup power. "It is here." The Slaught hadn't evacuated. They'd gone to ground, hidden themselves in preparation for something that made even their ancient, patient intelligence afraid. And that something had just arrived. The darkness the Slaught had documented for millennia. The ending they'd archived humanity to survive. It wasn't coming. It had arrived. The cold wasn't natural. It didn't creep or seep. It manifested instantly, completely, as if the concept of warmth had simply been deleted from reality. Kristavia's breath turned to ice crystals before it left her lips. Her armor, designed to maintain temperature in the void of space, struggled and failed. Around her, acolytes collapsed, not from the cold itself, but from something the cold carried. A presence, a weight. The feeling of being observed by something so vast that its attention alone was crushing. The vermiori's walls began to split. Not breaking, splitting, like reality was peeling apart to reveal something underneath. Through the cracks, Kristavia saw darkness absolute. Not the darkness of unlit space, the darkness of unspace. Of places where the material universe had never existed and never would. The warp, she thought at first. Some new manifestation of chaos, but it was wrong for that. Chaos was hungry, invasive, corrupting. This was empty, patient, indifferent in a way that made chaos's malevolence seem almost warm by comparison. From the lower levels, the Slaught emerged, not slowly, not hiding. They poured from ventilation shafts, from sealed chambers, from inside walls where they'd compressed themselves into spaces no living thing should fit. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All of the vermiaries captured specimens, and apparently countless more that had been hiding in plain sight, integrated into the facility's very structure. They didn't attack. They moved with coordinated precision, forming a living barrier between the human staff and the spreading cracks in reality, protecting them. Thessaly was on her knees, ice forming in her hair, staring at the nearest Slaught with an expression beyond fear, recognition. She understood before Kristavia did. Before any of them did. The Slaught weren't guarding the humans from something outside. They were guarding them from seeing what was outside. From comprehending what pressed against reality's thin walls. Because human minds weren't meant to process it. The Slaught had worn humanity long enough to know that some truths destroyed consciousness just by being perceived. One of the pale, segmented creatures turned its eyeless head toward Kristavia. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ice, through the walls, through her bones. "Close your eyes, inheritor. This is not for your kind to witness. Not yet, not until you are ready." But Kristavia didn't close her eyes. She'd spent a lifetime staring into darkness, cataloging horrors, documenting nightmares. She would not flinch now. She looked through the widening cracks, forced herself to see what lay beyond, and in that moment understood why the Slaught had spent 10,000 years preparing humanity for this. It wasn't the warp, it wasn't chaos, it was older. Much older. A hunger that predated reality itself, that existed in the spaces between existence, waiting for universes to grow old enough to consume. The Slaught had a name for it, translated through their alien consciousness into concepts human language could barely hold. The unbecoming. The force that eventually claimed all created things, that returned complexity to void, that ended not with violence, but with simple, patient unraveling. Chaos corrupted, the unbecoming erased, and it had found the Imperium. No, that wasn't right. Krastavia's mind reeled as understanding clicked into place. The unbecoming hadn't found anything. It had always been here. Since before humanity first looked at stars. Since before the Age of Strife. Since before the Dark Age of technology. The Slaught's hadn't been documenting humanity's decline. They'd been documenting humanity's final years, before the unbecoming finished its slow consumption of the galaxy's eastern edge. The ghoul stars weren't called that because of the threats that lived there. They were called that because reality itself was dying there, one star system at a time, being unmade by something that made extinction look merciful by comparison. 10,000 years, the Slaught voice said, and Krastavia realized it was speaking only to her now. The others couldn't hear it. We have kept the unbecoming from accelerating, slowed its approach, diverted its attention. We are immune to its touch because we were born in the dark between realities. We do not exist enough to be unmade, but you exist too much. You burn too bright. Your Astronomicon is a beacon that calls to the unbecoming like blood in water. Every day your species lights the dark, you hasten your ending. The Emperor's light. The Astronomicon that guided humanity through the warp, that held the Imperium together across impossible distances. It was killing them, marking them for consumption by something that fed on illumination itself. The bitter irony would have been funny if it wasn't so absolutely devastating. The archive, Krastavia managed to speak through numb lips. You're saving versions of us that don't shine, versions that can survive in darkness, that can rebuild without the crutch of your God Emperor's light, that can exist quietly, carefully, without drawing the unbecoming's full attention. The Slaught shifted, and Krastavia saw that it was maintaining some kind of psychic barrier, holding back the pressure from the cracks in reality with effort that was clearly straining even its alien biology. We do not save you from kindness. We save you because we are lonely. Because in 1,000,000 years of existence, we have never found another species capable of changing as you change, of adapting as you adapt. We wear you because you are fascinating, and we would prefer a galaxy with humans in it, even if we must carry you through extinction to ensure it. The walls screamed, not metaphorically. The structure itself was making sounds as reality bent around the facility. Krastavia heard metal twist, stone crack, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing. The unbecoming, inhaling, preparing to consume everything the vermiary contained, everything the Slaught had spent decades collecting. She thought of all the specimens, all the documentation, all the carefully preserved evidence of infiltration. It would all disappear, be unmade, as if it had never existed. The Slaught seemed to read her thoughts. The vermiary was bait, a concentration of our presence large enough to attract the unbecoming's attention, to draw it here, to this empty moon, far from inhabited worlds. We are sacrificing ourselves to buy time. Every moment it feeds on us is a moment it is not feeding on your Imperium. Krastavia's head snapped up. No, you can't. The archive, your work, everything you've preserved, is safe. The archive is not here. It has never been in the ghoul stars. We would not place 10,000 years of collected human experience where the unbecoming could find it. The Slaught made a sound that might have been laughter, might have been something else entirely. Did you truly believe we would be so careless? The transmission Callista's probe received, the structure she saw, that was theater. Misdirection. We needed the Inquisition to believe the archive was vulnerable, to respond, to send their expert, you, Krastavia. We needed you. The ice on her armor cracked as she tried to move forward. Why? Because someone must carry the truth. Someone the Imperium will listen to. When the unbecoming accelerates its consumption, when the eastern sectors begin disappearing, when the light of your Astronomicon starts to dim, humanity will panic, will turn on itself, will purge and burn and destroy in search of enemies to blame. You must stop them. You must make them understand that their enemy is not infiltrators or heretics or Xenos. Their enemy is existence itself growing tired. And the only way to survive is to learn to live quietly, to abandon the bright defiance that defines your species and embrace the shadows where the unbecoming cannot see. You're asking us to stop being human. We are asking you to become human in new ways. The archive contains patterns, gene sequences that respond differently to warp exposure, cultural practices from isolated worlds that survived old night through caution rather than courage, psychological frameworks that allow cooperation without charismatic leadership. Everything humanity needs to rebuild as something that can survive the dark. The Slaughtht will teach you. The ones who remain embedded will guide you. You will hate us for it. You will resist. But you will survive. The cracks widened. Krestavia could feel the pull now, the unbecoming's hunger reaching through the barriers the Slaughtht maintained. It wanted her, wanted everyone, wanted to return them all to the nothing they'd been before consciousness, before identity, before the first human looked at fire and decided to make more. It would be so easy to let go, to stop struggling, to accept the end with dignity. She thought of Vescarmine, of his daughter who wasn't his daughter, of the smile that lasted too long, of every human who'd fought against infiltration, died defending humanity's purity, sacrificed themselves to preserve what they thought human meant. They'd all been fighting the wrong enemy, protecting humanity from the only force trying to save it. And now their purity would kill them. Their pride would end them. Their absolute certainty that human meant one specific thing would guarantee that human ceased to mean anything at all. Unless someone made them understand. Unless someone carried the message that survival sometimes looked like betrayal. That continuation sometimes required compromise. That the choice wasn't between human and Slaughtht, but between existing with help and not existing at all. How do I leave? Krestavia asked. If this facility is bait, if the unbecoming is already here, how do you expect me to escape? The Slaughtht moved aside. Behind it, a corridor remained intact, untouched by cold or cracks or the pressure of unmaking. A path maintained by sheer force of will, by every Slaughtht in the facility directing their psychic strength to keeping one route open. We hold it as long as we can. You run as fast as you are able. This is the covenant, witnessed in flesh, sealed in memory. We die so you carry truth. Krestavia looked at Thessaly, at the other acolytes. Some were unconscious from cold. Some were catatonic from glimpsing what lay beyond the cracks. None of them would make it. The corridor was barely wide enough for one person. The Slaughtht were maintaining it through sacrifice, and they didn't have strength to spare for multiple evacuations. She would leave alone, or she would stay and die with everyone else. Two choices. Both terrible, both necessary. She grabbed Thessaly's data slate, encrypted everything, every file, every observation, every piece of evidence she'd collected over 3 decades, compressed it into a single package that could be transmitted the moment she reached a functional Vox array. Looked at Thessaly one last time. The young woman's eyes were open, but unseeing, staring at something beyond the material plane. Broken, like so many others would break when the unbecoming's consumption accelerated. I'm sorry, Krestavia whispered, to Thessaly. To all of them. To the Slaughtht burning themselves out to maintain her escape route. To humanity itself, which would hate her for what she was about to do. She ran. The corridor collapsed behind her. She felt it. Felt the vermiary dying section by section, reality unraveling as the unbecoming fed. Felt the Slaughtht winking out like candles in a storm, their psychic presences extinguishing one by one as they were unmade. They didn't scream. They simply ceased. Returned to the nothing between existences from which they'd originally crawled. And they did it willingly, traded their continuation for hers. Not because they loved humanity, but because they needed humanity to understand, to change, to survive in ways that honored their millennia of work. She reached the surface, found Callista's ship already landing, the rogue trader having somehow known exactly when and where to arrive. Kristavia didn't question it, didn't have time. The moon itself was unraveling now, mountains dissolving into void, atmosphere dissipating into nothingness. She barely made it to the boarding ramp before the ground beneath her feet stopped being ground at all. In the ship, acceleration pressing her into emergency restraints, Kristavia watched through viewports as the vermieri became not there. No explosion, no dramatic ending, just cessation. As if the facility, the moon, everything had been a particularly vivid dream that someone finally woke from. The Slaughth's sacrifice, complete, absolute, effective. What happened? Callista's voice was tight with controlled panic. Kristavia closed her eyes, felt the weight of truth settling onto her shoulders like ceremonial armor made of lead. When she opened them again, when she spoke, her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen the end and chosen to walk back from it bearing witness. Everything we knew was wrong. And I have to make the Imperium understand before it's too late. The ship jumped to warp space. Behind them, where a moon had been, there was only darkness. Hungry, patient, growing.